Hello, and welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Heathclyff St. James DeVille. Heathcliff and I have been communicating via email for a few years now. We've both lost someone we love to suicide. Heathcliff experienced the devastating loss of his partner of 30 years to suicide in 2021. I asked him to be on the podcast today to share about his experience at a bereavement tea ceremony. This is something that he shared with me via email, and he agreed to come and talk about it. So we'll all get to hear a little bit more about this bereavement tea ceremony. But before we dive into the episode, let me tell you a little bit more about Heathcliff. He resides in Australia, and through his writing, he aims to shed light on the unique challenges of grieving a suicide loss, offering insights that may resonate with others on this journey. He's currently establishing a suicide loss support group and is dedicated to working in the postvention field. With qualifications in professional counseling and plans to join a peer support program, he's just really committed to supporting others who are survivors of suicide loss. Heathcliff recognizes that such a tragic loss can disrupt even the strongest spiritual beliefs, creating an additional layer of grief. He has a deep interest in exploring the spiritual dimensions of suicide, particularly the impact on one's connection to their spiritual path. So, without further ado, let's get on with the podcast. Hello, I'm Sue Andersen, grief guide and yoga teacher, dedicated to helping individuals navigate the challenging journey of loss. Welcome to Growth from Grief, where I aim to offer strategies to transition from the depths of grief to the path of healing. Whatever loss you are grappling with, here you'll discover support to ease both the physical and emotional burdens of grief. Together, let's embark on a journey toward strength, peace, and healing. I'm so glad you are here. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Growth from Grief. I have with me Heathcliff, who you just heard me talk a little bit about, give you a little bit about his bio. So welcome, Heathcliff, to the podcast from
Thank you.
Australia. Different. I just have to say to everybody, one of the things that was a challenge for me was time zones. And so we kept trying to get the time zone right. So it was a reasonable time for both of us and didn't interrupt, work or personal schedules. So that worked out. So I'm glad. So Heathcliff, I'd like to begin, if you wouldn't mind, talking a little bit about your loss. We actually connected via email about 6 months after your partner died, and I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically my partner had like a mental health issue that was sort of under control for 25 years. But a dentist suggested he needed to change his medication, and he went off his medication, couldn't see doctors because that was during COVID. We had a lot of lockdowns in Australia. And yeah, and then just he succumbed to that, and I just found him one night, and it was really quite harrowing, and it threw me. I describe it as it just shattered my life from that moment on, and it's been a very long journey. And then, of course, I connected to, the organisation that I found you through,
Mhm.
and that's been very healing. Just meeting you, reading your emails, things like that. Like, especially I like your little newsletter that you put out.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I one of the impacts for me is I lost my connection to my spiritual belief for a long, long time, and probably for 16 months. But I just, every day, I just got up and said, "Dear Lord and Lady, I don't know if I really believe in you anymore, but I'm just going to try and keep the connection open." And then eventually I come back to it. So, yeah. And
Yeah, that it's you mentioned the word shattered, which I think
yeah,
is very apt for a description for suicide loss. I think it just really shatters your life and puts you so out of balance, as you described. And your loss is not that long ago either,
mm,
so that's you said it took you 16 months to kind of get back into finding your spiritual practice again, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's you know, a, not really a long time, I guess, but probably seems like a long time. But
yeah.
you allowed that to happen. You kind of kept that channel open, allowed that to happen. And I imagine that is it's a very important thing to you, and that's why you allowed it to just be and be open. Is that a good description?
Yeah, I think so, because yeah, I've done a lot of work with a psychologist too. So that was really good. And, she's pretty on board with the stuff that I'm sort of into. So yeah, I think I did keep the channels open because the deeper part of me probably recognized that that was an important thing.
Hmm.
Um, Plus, if I hadn't have done that, it would have been another loss.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
because there was several losses around the time of my partner. Like, there was my mother, then our dog, then my partner, then
Mm,
my home. A whole lot of things were happening all at once. So that would have been just another loss, and a very major loss. Yeah.
right,
So yeah. So I did
right.
keep the channels open. Yeah.
Very, very, very traumatic with all of those losses on top of each other. And from a grieving standpoint, trying to unpack a little bit about each one of those, or trying to grieve each one of those losses, which in and of themselves would have been a very difficult thing. Your mother, your dog, your home. I mean, and then your partner. That's a
Mm.
lot. That's really a lot to go through in a very short period of time, 3 years or something, right? Three,
Yeah.
four.
So the losses took place over 2 months.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
it was my mum in September, 4 weeks later my dog, and 6 weeks later my partner.
Yeah.
And then 4 weeks after that, I had to move because
Mm.
I found my partner. So it wasn't really healthy for me to be in that house.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right,
So then I
right.
ended up moving into this little flat, but I quite like it now. So
Oh,
it's
good.
quite, yeah, it's quite good. It's an upstairs flat. So, because when I did move a couple of times, because the second flat I had, which was downstairs here, I was actually broken into.
Oh,
So
wow.
it a lot of that kept reigniting PTSD.
Sure.
So then I said to the agent, "Can I take the flat upstairs because it was available?" And he said, "Oh yeah," and he said, "Oh, you can just move in there, and there's no rent increase or anything." So yeah, so I moved up here, and I quite like it. Yeah, it's a 1950s flat, so
Oh,
it
yeah,
suits
yeah.
my personality. Yeah, 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 yeah.
That's good. Um, So I'm wondering, what have you found? There's all kinds of things that we can do to help us in the grief process, whether it's joining groups or individual counseling or different kinds of healing modalities. I'm wondering, what have you found through this journey? What have you found helpful to you in terms of these different kinds of healing modalities?
Okay, so the the major one would be locking in with a suicide loss support group. I didn't find that for about 8 months after my loss. And so I felt very alone. And then I sort of come across this group. And so I thought, I didn't really want to go, to be quite honest. But I did. I remember being on the train. I was quite nervous going, but I went, and it was really, really different to hear people talk about loss that was real people, not just people in a book or a magazine.
Right.
I remember the man beside me talking about his loss, and I was just, it was very cathartic. I know that sounds probably contradictory, but it was very cathartic because I no longer felt myself to be alone. So that was one of the things I did. I do a lot of writing. So I do a lot of journaling as well as writing articles exploring aspects of suicide loss. I started doing mandalas.
Yes.
And colouring in. So I bought a couple colouring in books. I bought kids' books because I don't really like the adult ones. They're too complex for me. They're too busy. Yeah. So I bought some colouring books and colouring pencils and things like that. And then I started attending just little events here and there. I went to my first Suicide Prevention Day walk, which they had a section for postvention, for loss to suicide. That was really good. So I actually wrote about that as a way of trying to help people who have had a loss who might be fearful of what that's like, because I try to be very honest. So I wrote about how it was actually very challenging going there, and I was feeling sick on the way and all this sort of stuff, but I said it was worth it because you felt like you were part of the community. So I tried to do a lot of that stuff too, to sort of also help other people. Yeah.
I think that's really, really important because it is very scary and it's takes a lot of courage to, to move forward and just try something new when you're in this, new loss, any loss, of course, but with a suicide, I just feel there's so much more complexity. And I think it's important I think your writing is important, that other people understand that, hey, it's normal to feel nervous, but don't let that stop you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think it's when we try to hoodwink people and we try to say, oh, you should do this, it's really helpful. But part of what I want to do future-wise is actually run a support group. And I believe that everything that we do has to be road tested. And then because then we connect into what can occur. So a good example would be part of my healing that was suggested by a doctor is that I write about some of my loss. So I ended up writing 5 pages of all the things that I could remember over my life, like with my partner. And it was really difficult because every one of those things was now a loss. Like it was never going to be repeated.
Right.
So it was very challenging. But the doctor obviously didn't tell me that. Luckily, I'm sort of, switched on enough to realize it would be like that. And then I went back to the doctor and said, you need to do a caveat with everything that you suggest to people. Because for someone else, that could have been a very traumatic experience, and we don't know where that would have led.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I have done some writing exercises like in a group kind of setting. So it's it would be shorter and a little bit more controlled. So there's a clinician there that can help guide people, which I liked because I felt safe. I felt safe. And I think safety is really important. When you're vulnerable, you're in that vulnerable kind of a position.
mm,
whether it's one-on-one with a doctor, or even if
mm,
it's, but especially if it's in a group, because there is
mm,
that,
mm.
vulnerability.
And it does happen, doesn't it? Like I was at a suicide prevention course I did, and I we were talking about pets, and I started talking about my dog, and I just said I can't do this, and I just had to go outside, and
Mm,
then someone come out, and I said, yeah, look, I'll be okay. I just because my partner's death is very tied to my dog's death.
mm,
It's very hard for people to sort of understand that, but
yes,
it it's like I lost my family, so that's why it
sure.
was very difficult. Yeah, yeah.
I understand that.
Hmm.
So one thing that you told me about in one of our email exchanges was something that I have never heard of, and you wrote about it very beautifully to me, and I could picture it in my mind because of the way you described it. But I think it's so interesting, and I'd love for you to talk about this, what's called a bereavement tea ceremony.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
my first question is, how did you even hear about this?
Okay. So so I did an LGBT online support group, and they eventually just sent me an email and said, "Oh, we've got this thing coming up for the first time. Would you like to participate?" And I thought, "Oh yeah, it's something different. Gets me." I work very long hours, so it was a good night off work just to do something different. So I went along, and I loved it. It's very challenging, but it was a really interesting thing that the lady developed, and she originally developed it for her own healing from her loss,
Okay, that
and
was my
then
question. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, right. So and then she decided to just put it out there, and so that's how I heard about it. Yeah,
Now, I have another question about the person that did this, the facilitator or the host
yeah.
of the tea ceremony. Um, had did she know about tea ceremonies? Like, had she done just a regular tea ceremony and understood the significance and the different teas and all of that?
Yeah, she's a an art therapist. I have to think there for a minute. Yeah, so she's an art therapist, and she's Chinese Malaysian. So she had a culture that they do a lot of tea ceremony.
Okay.
But this particular ceremony was something that she developed herself and
Okay.
decided to share with others. And I'm really grateful that she did. Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit about, maybe give us a little bit of a of an overview of that tea ceremony, and then maybe pick a couple of highlights for you, like what really stood out for you. I think that would be great.
Yeah, okay. So you want me just to describe how it all goes about? Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So basically, it starts off, there's an introduction to it, and she talks a bit about the significance of frankincense and the different types of teas that we drink. Um, it's very silent, which is part of the reason it's very cathartic, because some people there had not been able to connect to their grief, and especially being part of the LGBT community, some people had no one that they could talk to. So it started off. Um, we were past the incense. It was like one of the blocks that you put on a charcoal block,
Hmm.
that sort of incense. Yeah.
Yes.
So we were past that, and we had to swing it 3 times anti-clockwise. It was a way of cleansing and centering ourselves to begin with. Then she took what appeared to be a very long time setting up the first tea, because it's a ceremony. So
Right.
obviously it's very slow, and like she, filled up every cup with hot water, and then she tipped each one out very slowly, and to cleanse the cup and all this sort of stuff. They were actually bowls, which I thought was quite interesting too. So she did that, and then our first tea was a Malaysian, I suppose you call it plant, for want of a better word, called padman, which is a bit like a nutty taste, a very sweet taste. And while we drank that, we reflected on the loss itself. And then the second that went on for about, oh, must be about maybe half an hour, just that first tea. There was obviously a lot of tears. People were more sobbing than out and out, crying really loud. We didn't actually have tissues. I thought that was interesting, but luckily the girl beside me, she had some. Yeah, and then it was very challenging. It was very, very challenging. And then the second tea, it was a similar thing again. She took all the cup, and she did it very slow. So each cup was taken individually back to her and then individually cleaned, and then it went on again. That took about 40 minutes, and that was a chamomile tea. And then as she did it, we had to reflect on the person who had now been lost in terms of their relationship back to us. And at that point in time, we sort of, each time she passed the tea, we had to stare in her eyes for just a couple of seconds. I found that very challenging because I don't really like staring people in the eyes. I don't mind looking at people. I just don't like that sort of thing. And then we had to pass. So we were given a different cup. We had to pass that to the person on the left. This is all done in silence, as I said. And then we looked at that person, and then they drank their tea, and then it was repeated with us. They passed it back to us. And there was meditation music playing, and we just had a lot of time to connect to whatever thought it was occurring at that time. And then the last tea, I'm sorry, I'm a bit hazy as to what the last tea was, but that was reflecting on what the loss for ourselves and for the other person sort of meant overall. Plus, it was also about connecting to maybe your ancestors. Who have got, and like for instance, for my partner, I imagine him being met by his parents, that sort of thing. It was very challenging. It was very confronting to do this. Like every time I shut my eyes, I envisaged my partner and my dog running in a field. And I was a mess in a way. Like I was just tears running down my face. I wasn't audible, but I was definitely, there was that response. But as you probably know, our tears of grief, they have different chemicals to normal tears, and so those tears actually help us heal, which is part of why it was a good journey.
Yes. When I read your email and you described similar to what you're talking about now, two things stood out for me. One was the staring in another person's eyes, and that brought back a memory for me. I was doing a meditation training probably 3 or 4 years after my son died, and one of the exercises that we did was we just stared in each other's eyes for it was a long time. I mean, it was probably 2 minutes. I mean, 2 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but when you're staring into somebody's eyes, that's a long time. And and I had all of this grief, and the woman who was my partner, she said, "Are you okay?" Because she could see it in my eyes. I mean, I wasn't crying or anything, but or no tears, but I definitely know that she could tell that there was something going on, because it was just a regular meditation training. It wasn't anything that was related to grief. So that brought back that memory for me in terms
Yeah.
of how powerful that is to do that, staring
Mm,
in someone's eyes. And you were just talking about that, how it
mm,
affected you.
mm.
Um, and then the other thing that struck me was that this whole ceremony, which was what, a couple of hours, sounds
Yeah,
like?
about 2.5 hours all
Yeah,
up. Yeah.
all in silence. And if you are a person that hasn't, befriended your grief, for lack of a better word, you haven't,
Mm.
allowed your grief to happen, I would imagine that silence would have been very, very difficult.
Yes, yes, it would have been very difficult. There were some people there that hadn't really talked about their grief before, um, or probably connected to it even.
Mm,
There was a little bit of conversation, but it was more, yeah, just maybe 5 minutes here and there.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the yeah. But the stare in the eyes, yeah, you're right. It was very challenging because I think what happens is when you stare in someone's eyes, yeah, like the eyes really are like the window to the soul. So,
Yes.
like I did a project, this is just an aside, but it ties into this. And I went through some photographs of when I first experienced my loss up until now.
Hmm.
And I definitely have changes. Now, for the first year, I felt really hideously ugly. Like I wouldn't go out and to go to work. Luckily, I work overnight and I work by myself. So I sort of just, yeah, went out when it was dark. It was really strange,
Hmm.
like a really strange reaction. So, and I look at those early photos, and if I look at my eyes in particular, the first photo, I look almost, well, just empty. Yeah, just
Sure.
empty.
Yeah.
And then, but as the photos move on, I start to, yeah, come back to a bit more normality. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah,
The
so the
new
eyes,
normal.
yeah.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, yeah, I call it the, yeah, the different me,
Hmm.
you know. So
Hmm.
I'm my core self is the same, but there's definitely a different me. Like I think a much more deeper and empathic person now than I was before.
Mm.
Like I've always felt that I was empathic, and I actually studied to be a counsellor, um, and I chose that as an elective grief, and I read about suicide. But
Hmm.
like most people, I just assumed that suicide loss was the same as all grief, and it definitely isn't. It has so many of its own unique
Right.
nuances. Yeah, yeah,
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. And you're reminding me of actually I was talking to somebody about this earlier today, and I don't know if I have the pronunciation correct, but I believe it's called kintsugi, which is a Japanese um, pottery technique, I think.
yeah.
I don't know if I think it's the technique of taking the broken pottery and and melding it together with gold.
Yes, yes, yes. I've heard about that.
Yes,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
yes. And
Mm,
I remember a few years back that I read about that, and I was like, wow, I really like that. And I happened to be reading an article where the author was comparing that to grief, like
mm,
to how you change and through grief, and that you know you're still you. You got
mm,
your parts, but there's this you know other um, this gold thread that's going through
yeah.
that puts you back together. And
Mm,
I really liked that. I liked that image. It made me feel like, okay, I'm still have my parts of myself. I can't be the same
mm,
person I was before,
yeah.
but I'm still that person with maybe a little extra something because it's gold.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I like that. That's gold. That's
I mean,
good. That's a good one.
if it was black, it would be like blah, but it's like
Yeah,
gold.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
It's gold, so it stands out a bit. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's good. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so yeah, so that just sort of just that reminded me of it when you were talking about your, uh, how you saw yourself
Mm,
in those photos, changing over
mm.
time.
Yeah, yeah.
So tell me, in this tea ceremony, do you feel like, I don't really like to use the word comparing, but do you
Mm.
feel like that helped you um, more, or is it something that you would do again? Or I guess what I'm kind of trying to understand is something like writing. You
Mm.
do that all the time, and you would do it continuously.
Yeah.
Um, Potentially a group, you would do that, multiple times, but is something like the tea ceremony something that you would do again? Um, did you feel that it was beneficial to you?
Um, yeah, I definitely felt it was beneficial. I probably would do it again, but I think it would be something that you wouldn't do a lot because I think it would take away the specialness of it.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
so it's a good adjunct to other healing modalities. So whereas with mandalas, yeah, or coloring in books, there's
Yeah.
something that you can do all the time because they help to balance the inner and the outer you. So they're a really good thing to do on a regular basis. But I think the tea ceremony, yeah, I think it's something that I really enjoy maybe more as a one-off event.
Mm-hmm.
But that's
Mm-hmm.
not to say that, if she were to have that again, I probably would go again. But a third time, I don't think I would. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I was just
yeah,
curious because it does sound like something very special.
yeah.
Um, and that, the specialness of it, the uniqueness of it,
Mm.
um, would it wouldn't maybe be the same because you kind of would know what was going to happen, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really important point that you've raised too, because as we move forward in our grief, we could do the same ceremony, but we may not get anything out of it. And then we might sort of doubt if we ever did, which is one of the things that led me to write about it, because I
Yeah.
wanted to capture what it was really like for me at that
Mm-hmm.
time. Now, 10 years down the line, if I'm describing that, it's going to be very different because, I'm away from those feelings. But if I go
Sure.
back to my article, it's going to reignite the feelings. A bit like the body keeps the score. It's that sort of
Yes.
mentality. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, mm,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree. Um, Heathcliff, before we complete our interview, our podcast interview, is there anything else that you would like to tell our listeners, or, words of encouragement, anything that you want to end this conversation with?
Um, yeah, I would just say that, try to do what you can, which feels right for you. And if it's a little bit scary, if you can just challenge yourself a little bit, I think those things can actually start to help you. And just try not to limit yourself in what you do. So if you hear about a tea ceremony, try and go along.
Mhm.
If you feel like buying something from an op shop, who cares if it's something that you don't need? If it makes you feel happy for that moment, just do it. I mean, like, I went too far the opposite way. Like one of my reactions to grief is I spent $4,000 I didn't have just on stuff. I just
Right.
bought like 10 doona covers and all this sort of stuff. And I got into a lot of debt and I had to front up. And my therapist got to give me a letter to um, negate that debt. But I said, no, I'm not that sort of person. I don't want to look at something 5 years down the line and think I got it by default. Um, so I paid it all off, but it was good. It had its reasons. Mainly I did it because in the early days I didn't want to be here. So I needed something to look forward to coming through the post.
Sure.
But, I worked through it. And I think for other people, with the right sort of support and the right sort of, a little bit of your own inner challenge, I think we can get through this. We don't get through it as in over it, but we journey forward. We find out a little bit of a new balance, and we meet really interesting people. I mean, I've met you through all this,
Yes, I know.
I've met a lot of, like, through my grief group, I've met some people who have become sort of deep friends, more
Mm,
so than, like, in such a short period of time too.
right.
And so that's basically what I would say.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining, and
Yeah.
thanks everyone for listening to our conversation.